Okay, last lecture video, chapter 31. This one is a very short, brief chapter. I'm just going to cover a few basic principles out of this one. If you are interested in environmental biology, ecology, conservation biology, there's a lot of information in this chapter that we're not going to get to if you want to look at that just for your own interest. So I mentioned conservation biology. It is basically an offshoot of biology, or a scientific discipline, really a biological discipline dedicated to understanding and preserving biodiversity. Okay, so just like ecology, systematics, biochemistry, microbiology, those are all kind of offshoots of biology. And so this would be one of them as well. And last time in the last chapter, we talked about biodiversity just a little bit, and that's basically the number of different species in an area. Okay, so biodiversity is going to obviously include genetic diversity. Remember back in evolutionary change was very dependent upon allele frequencies and the genetic population or the gene pool of that particular population. So biodiversity, the more diverse, the more number of species in an area, the more genetic diversity there's going to be in that community, okay? So the greater genetic diversity, which would be included in biodiversity, would allow communities really and other species to adapt to changing environments. Okay, so species diversity is essentially the variety and relative number of species within a community. And again, the more diverse you are, the more buffering capability you have against such environmental disturbances. Okay, so what are some threats to biodiversity? One major one is habitat destruction. Okay, habitat loss affects a large majority of endangered species. And the most serious threat to habitat loss at this point in time is going to be that habitat loss that affects the tropical rainforests. And looking at satellite images, could be anywhere over 30,000 square miles of tropical rainforests are lost each year. That habitat is lost. And so that's a pretty significant amount. Even when a natural ecosystem is not completely destroyed, like in an example of deforestation, there can still be areas where small pieces of the habitat within a larger area is destroyed. And so say this is your large habitat area, maybe someone comes in here and destroys this part, and then maybe someone comes in and destroys this area. And so you begin to start fragmenting or causing habitat fragmentation, where you have broken into smaller and smaller pieces. And so bird species, big cats, large mammals can really be threatened by breaking up of their larger habitat. Another threat to biodiversity is overexploitation, overhunting, or overharvesting of a natural population at a rate that exceeds its ability to replenish its numbers. Let's see. An example here is the UN Food and Ag Organization estimates that 30% of global fish populations are overexploited. And these typically are in areas that are not governed by the UN or the US or other areas. We have pretty stringent hunting and fishing regulations in the US controlled lands and waters, but if you get out of there, you may have some issues. Another threat is invasive species, where a species that's not native to a particular area moves in and disrupts a community. And humans are typically the party responsible for the invasive species being introduced. Humans have transplanted native species all around the world. Here in the Lamar area, we have what are called Russian thistles. Those and kochia weeds are invasive species that were brought in early in the 1900s and thought to be, actually the kochia weed was thought to be a good crop at the time. It came over from Europe, and then the Russian thistle also came over from obviously Russia, and they have kind of taken over. They're very hardy and basically can outcompete some of the native plants and so forth here. And then when they dry up, they become tumbleweeds. Sometimes non-native species can become invasive. They increase in number at the expense of the native species. They compete for food or habitat and outcompete those native ones. The zebra mussel is another one. If you go to any lake in Colorado and you want to go boating, a lot of times you'll have to have your boat inspected to make sure you're not bringing zebra mussels into the lake, because it's a very invasive species and it will take over and outcompete a lot of the other fish and other freshwater organisms. Another major threat to biodiversity is pollution, and pollution is a multifaceted threat because it can take on many different forms. Can be pesticides, can be heavy metals like mercury, can be high levels of nutrients like we talked in the last chapter. Lots of different things. Talks about use of DDT, which is an insecticide, back in the mid-1900s, caused some issues in bird populations, and the birds would eat the insects that had the DDT insecticide, and then the birds would basically, it's called bioaccumulation, they would basically build up toxic levels of the DDT from eating the infected insects and become ill. But now DDT and other persistent pollutants, ones that don't break down in the environment, have been banned in the US and some other places as well. And so, so those are some of the threats to biodiversity, but how can we protect biodiversity? One way is through what are called core reserves, and these preserve biodiversity, and it's basically the formation of a natural area to protect those habitats or protect those areas from human use or human exploitation, I guess. And so these would be things like open spaces or forest preserves, wildlife reserves, those types of things. And typically when the ecologists are looking to set these up, they're going to look for the minimum amount of land necessary to sustain a viable population, and that's called the minimum critical area. and it's going to look at the different species that are there. And the minimum critical areas can vary a lot based on what species are going to be in that area and what is the availability of resources in that area. So typically, a minimum critical area is going to be set for the largest predator that's going to be in that area. And those that have large predators in very arid environments are going to need even more area. Another way that helps preserve biodiversity is wildlife corridors. So we talked about that fragmentation of habitats. Okay, wildlife corridors can help alleviate some of that fragmentation, like you can see in this image here, where you give basically a link between areas for animals to move through safely. And so a wildlife corridor is basically strips of protected area that link to other areas together. One example of a basically an area in Mexico that has been set aside for monarch butterflies is a reserve that the Mexican authorities put together so they could help with the declining monarch butterfly population. And now there's a 140-acre reserve that local landowners went together and decided to leave these areas and allow the butterflies to flourish there. Okay, so, oops, not sure why that moved there. Some things that you can do to make a difference in terms of biodiversity and also helping the environment. One is the conservation of energy. And so when you are living in an apartment or your dorm or house or whatever, you can adjust your heating and cooling temperatures. Okay, so maybe set your thermostat in the winter at 68 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. My family gets irritated at me because I'm used to colder temperatures. And so in the winter, it's not uncommon for us to have it at 63, 64, 65 in our house. And my philosophy is put on a jacket. Or maybe in the summer, turn your thermostat up to 78 degrees or, you know, something a little bit warmer so that, or maybe even just turn off your air conditioner so that you're conserving energy. Let's see, lighting. Obviously, one of the best ways is to turn the lights off when you leave a room, but maybe using energy efficiency bulbs and lighting structures. Hot water, take shorter showers. Okay, really long showers is kind of wasteful, not only for heating the energy needed to heat the water, but also wasting the water. Water is a precious resource, especially here in arid parts of the country. Use low efficiency appliances, making choices when you're doing transportation, recycling, reusing things as much as possible. Water bottles, reuse your grocery bags. I use those as trash cans for little trash can liners and things like that. Conserving water. You know, one thing that we have done in the last year is we have converted all of our flower beds into basically xeriscape. I have a few cacti growing because I like them. But we've basically stopped growing flowers because we'd water them twice a day and they would still burn up in the heat. And so we've kind of tried to conserve water that way. And then also limiting your use of things that could be pollutants or harsh chemicals, insecticides. herbicides and so forth. And like we talked in the last chapter, you know, it might be very beneficial too, like if you own a lawn, to be very careful on how much you fertilize your lawn. Okay, if you want to fertilize your lawn, that's great, you may need to do that, but a little goes a long way, and a little might be good and more is not always better. Okay, so that concludes our lecture for this semester. So no more lecture videos. There is a mastering assignment for you guys. Make sure you check that out and start studying for exam 5 and your final.